I noticed in a speech once that you gave when you were describing your political philosophy, you said you considered yourself a constitutional conservative. How would you differentiate or distinguish that from either being A, a libertarian, or B, what I consider myself to be a Reagan conservative?
Right. I think sometimes that with the libertarian, people associated with the party tends to be more liberal on social issues. I'm conservative on social issues, so I don't quite fit into that mold.
Because you oppose abortion rights, you're pro-life.
Right. And so I think that fits into it. And also, instead of maybe saying that we're never anywhere overseas, I say we need to be more judicious in where we are, and that I don't think we can afford to be everywhere all the time, but it also doesn't mean that we never intervene and that we can allow people to attack us. But the interesting thing is, even though my dad seems to take that position, he did vote for the use of force in Afghanistan. And some of the arguments we have are formal arguments in the sense that we think you should declare war since we haven't done it that way since World War II. And I would have definitely asked for a declaration of war. If I were in the Senate, I would have asked for a declaration of war with Afghanistan, but I would have voted for it because I think we can't let people organize in a country and attack us, and that there are times when we have to go in and prevent and find people that are organizing to attack us.
I don't want to get too technical here, but when the use of force, the Constitution does not specifically say that any specific phrase or words need to be used for a formal declaration of war. In my mind, the use of force declaration is a declaration of war.
It kind of is, and I don't necessarily strongly disagree. But what I would say is that you ended up having people like John Kerry who said, "Well, I voted for the use of force before I voted
for the $87 billion before I voted against it."
And then he ended up saying, "Well, I never thought Bush was going to use it." So I think really when you have the words, there is historic value to saying declaring war. And the thing about it is I tell people that I can't always tell you in advance how I'm going to vote on whether we declare war or not, but I can say I will force the wording to be that way because I think it needs to be the most momentous vote that any congressman or senator runs for office votes on. And while I run for office because I'm concerned about the debt, the most important vote I will ever take is whether to send your kids to war or to send you to war, and we have to take that seriously. We have to really look at the intelligence, the detail. We have to discuss what is in our national security, what isn't, and have a full-blown debate. But in the end, then we unify as a country and say we've either been attacked or we're imminent danger of being attacked, and we have to do this. But I think if we declare war, I think it's one reason why historically people tend to look back to World War II and they don't tend to have so much dissension over World War II that they had over Vietnam and the Korean War and the different Persian Gulf Wars, because we didn't take the time and say, let's have a formal declaration of war.
You're pro-life. You're against all legislative earmarks. And by the way, why the Republican Party doesn't support that across the board at this moment in time is beyond me. I think it's a huge mistake that they don't have the courage of their conviction and principle to do that. And maybe an area where I would disagree with you on is the federal involvement in drug enforcement. I'm not sure what your position is there, but I read that and I was curious if you take a libertarian view on that.
Well, I tend to think that most of the enforcement is best done at the state and local level. As far as, I think one of the things in the past 10 years or 15 years that has probably been the thing that bothers so many people, and myself included, is that you can have a kid from the inner city who's caught with a certain amount of crack cocaine, equivalent amount of powder cocaine. A kid who lives in the suburbs with rich parents gets off with a slap on the wrist, and this kid from the inner city gets 10 years in prison with a mandatory sentence. I'd like better that the judges locally, like I know the judges in my town, and they try to mete out justice. Possession of a drug is not something we want to encourage. Use of drugs we do not want to encourage, but I'm not sure I want a 16-year-old kid, or heaven forbid my 16-year-old kid, in jail for 10 years for possession. I want the judge locally to be able to decide what the penalty is, and for the local community to decide. We have drug courts here. We try to mete out justice that isn't 10 years in prison. Some of these kids are abused in prison. I mean, and it really is just an awful way to think about going about something that is an awful problem, but maybe incarceration is not always the answer.
That was probably one of the most thoughtful answers I've ever gotten from a libertarian friend, or more libertarian leaning on the drug issue, that I've ever heard in my life, honestly, because I've been I'm so anti-drug that I believe we should have really strong laws. Let me